Hello, and a warm welcome to all our viewers and listeners joining us from across the world. We are delighted to bring you the very first episode of this special Global South Indaba series. Thank you for being with us for what promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. Our theme today is Reflections on Decoloniality, a Multidisciplinary Dialogue. Joining us is a distinguished scholar whose work embodies this spirit in profound ways. It is my honor to introduce to you Assistant Professor Anotida Chikumbu, PhD, from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga in the United States. Dr. Chikumbu, welcome to the Global South Indaba. We are thrilled to have you with us. To begin, could you briefly introduce yourself? Who is Dr. Anotida Chikumbu?
Thank you, Mr. David, for the opportunity. I must start by applauding the work that you are doing. I do greatly appreciate, the interviews that you have conducted with Global South Indaba. I believe it's a noble contribution to the knowledge industry. I'm Dr. Anotida Chikumbu. I'm currently serving as an assistant professor of African history. I'm on a tenure-track position at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga here in the United States. I just recently started this job this August. I previously worked at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I did my PhD. I was in the Department of History in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. Shout out to the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. It is the best college at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I would encourage your viewers and listeners to apply there. I'm also a member of the Military Welfare History Network that is based at the University College Dublin. Unfortunately, when we did our last conference, I wasn't able to see you there in Dublin, but hopefully I'll be able to do it next time. I also host the Dr. Anotida Chikumbu Book Series, in which I've invited and hosted hundreds and hundreds of professors who have launched their books published by Harvard University Press, Oxford University Press, the University of Johannesburg Press, Wits University Press, a number of presses that I've managed to work with and launch the books on our platform. That has been a very interesting thing to do. I teach the history of Zimbabwe and the history of South Africa here at the University of Tennessee, particularly with a focus on colonialism and apartheid. I am also interested in military history. I've dedicated much of my academic career so far to expanding the knowledge of Southern Rhodesia's involvement in the Second World War, or the participation of Africans in the Second World War, and the legacy that war has had on African countries, on our economies, on our societies, and how we commemorate it. So basically, that's what I can say about myself. I'm a strong supporter of Real Madrid.
Hola Madrid. Well, Dr. Chikumbu, thank you for your service in the intellectual field. You seem to be doing a lot, and for that, we really do appreciate you. To set the stage, many of us encounter the word decoloniality in different contexts, and it often carries varied meanings. Could you start by sharing what decoloniality means to you and why it is such an urgent conversation for the Global South today?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very important question because the term decoloniality is used across various disciplines, of course, to mean in different contexts, to imply particularly different things. But I would just try to give an interpretation of how I've understood it from an interdisciplinary perspective, because it is used indeed in an interdisciplinary fashion. But before I get to do that, I would just want to emphasize to your viewers and listeners that there are scholars who have done research into this. We have written extensively and have attempted to break down these issues for us. So I would recommend that, you go and look at the works of Dr. Sabelo Gacheni Ndlovu. He has a very particular book called Epistemic Freedom, that I'd want to recommend. I've interviewed him on the book series, and we've talked extensively about it. This is perfect. I like that a lot. I would actually, recommend the introductory part also helps to break down these issues. So I would recommend that viewers have a look at that book. There's also the work of Dr. Walter Mignolo. Apparently, these scholars have published quite a number of works. So I would encourage that, if any one of their works stands out for you, I would encourage that you go and read them. But I'll say decoloniality in a very brief way. It is an interdisciplinary framework for theorizing, interpreting, and understanding the world in a way that dismantles the legacy that colonialism has left on our understanding of quite a number of issues, whether it be fashion, whether it be beauty, whether it be education, whether it be sports, whether it be politics, whether it be the economy, sociology, anthropology, and science. So it's actually a framework that is interdisciplinary and that can be used to interpret quite a number of things. I think on a very basic and rudimentary level, this is what I can say is meant by decoloniality.
Interesting. A framework for theorizing the world. Interesting. Thank you so much for that.
Yes.
Just to take the conversation a step further, in your view, what is the difference between decoloniality now and decolonization?
Again, that's an interesting one because they are also used interchangeably across different, fields. But, as a historian, I think you have probably asked the right person because we use those terms a lot.
Yeah.
So now that I've defined decoloniality, I will just proceed and explain decolonization, and then I'll try to summarize. So decolonization, in a historical way, we just treat it as a historical time frame, a time period that is characterized by the rise of African nationalism, liberation, and independence movements that gave birth to nation states that we have today that were formerly colonized. I would say this is a period that begins from the end of the Second World War, because historians have argued that the Second World War played a very significant role in to the birth of this decolonization that we're talking about. So it's a period that begins from about 1945 up until the 1990s, when the last set of nation states were born, the likes of South Africa, after years and years of fighting against apartheid. So I can say decolonization, come to think of it as this period that we had this whole lot of liberation wars, liberation movements. In the case of the country I come from, Zimbabwe, we have something that's popularly known as the Second Chimrenga. Some people call it the Zimbabwe Independence War, others call it the Rhodesian Bush War. But that particular time is a time that we were fighting against colonialism. So it is a time of decolonization. We then got to get independence out of that kind of movement. So it was characterized by the rise of African nationalism, by the rise of the desire to rule, to have an African kind of government, black majority rule, the rule of Africans by Africans. But it is important to emphasize that decolonization as an idea, the rise of African nationalism as an idea, the rise of independence, freedom movements is not something that came as a result of the Second World War. It's not something that was new after 1945. It had always been there in the history of Africa throughout, because colonialism was not a welcome institution. I have to emphasize this. From the very day that it was imposed, it was fought and resisted by Africans. That is why we've read about the histories of the Maji rebellions, the First Chimrenga, the Anglo-Ndebele War. All those wars were wars that demonstrate that colonialism was not welcome. But what we see after 1945 is just a systematic, a more modern way of championing the independence movement, which was characterized by the formation of political parties for the first time in some countries, which was characterized by the role played by African trade unions, the formation of liberation movements, and so forth, and the hosting of these constitutional conferences that gave birth to the formation of constitutions that formed nation states, independent nation states that we have today. So after the attainment of independence, we call these countries free nation states. But it is important to understand that at a conceptual level, some of the legacies that were left by colonialism were not just dismantled by the attainment of political independence, but the coming in of a black president, a black parliament, a black cabinet. Several other areas of life were still colonized. Our education system was still colonized. Our ways of viewing beauty and assessing beauty was still colonized. Our ways of doing sports, our linguistic structure and organization was still colonized. Even the way that we dress. So it is now our attempt to try and dismantle those remaining vestiges of colonialism that we call decoloniality and not decolonization.
It's getting interesting, Dr. Anotida Chikumbu. And so many ideas are coming to me as you were speaking. And one of the thoughts that are coming to me is, could it be said that decoloniality seeks to address what decolonization could not fully address?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And then you're talking about these structures, these institutions that decolonization did not dismantle. And to me, I was just thinking about what Anibo Quijano talks about when he talks about coloniality of power, and he talks about these matrices of power
Yes.
that are at work and how they are still at work. And it actually reminds me of that statement that that Professor Awota Mignolo likes to quote when he talks about coloniality or colonialism is not over,
Oh
but
yeah,
all
it's all
over.
over.
Yeah.
It's all over.
Interesting. I
Yeah.
think it's really getting interesting. So, what would you consider to be the key tenets of decoloniality?
Well, it's just basically three of them.
Yeah.
When we say the principal tenets of decoloniality, we're just simply talking about the pillars
Hmm.
that decoloniality seeks to achieve,
Okay.
or the target, the purpose
Hmm.
of decoloniality when it is
Hmm.
applied as a framework for
Hmm.
understanding. Because remember, we are
Hmm.
treating it as an interdisciplinary framework for understanding
Hmm.
the world
Hmm.
from different perspectives.
Hmm.
So, as a framework, what then does it seek to do? So, number one, at the center of decoloniality is what we call dismantling Western hegemony, or dismantling what we can call Eurocentrism. This Eurocentrism is the one that was planted by the coming in of colonization. I can briefly describe that in a more historical way. So, most of the colonized regions of the world were colonized by European countries. So the European lifestyle, European political ways of doing things, European economic systems were the ones that were put in place in these colonies, particularly in settler colonies, to be more technical as a historian. So that aspect that we call Eurocentrism was cemented and consolidated over years. It impacted how we do education. It impacted how we do our politics. It impacted how we do our dressing. I'm trying to say it in a simplified way. It impacted even our architectural industry and sector. So by doing that, we say colonialism centered Europeanness, in the way that we view things, which we then now call Eurocentrism. In other words, it actually cemented the dominance of Western, intellectual schools of thought and Western ways of knowing things. It centered it on our African, culture and systems of life. So when we are applying this framework that we call decoloniality, one of the principal tenets of that decoloniality is to decenter that Eurocentrism, is to decenter that Western hegemony. Number two, which is something that complements the first tenet, is the centering of Africanness in our framework of understanding things, putting in place or prioritizing the African experience, prioritizing how Africans theorize, interpret, and understand the world from their perspective in the absence of the dominance of this Eurocentric domination that we're talking about. In history, we say we're giving African historians the voice. We're giving African people the voice themselves. We want them to speak about their experiences. We want them to tell their history, not somebody else to come and tell them what their history should be. So the centering of Africanness, the centering of African knowledges and knowledge systems is one particular aspect that also complements the first tenet that I told you about. The last tenet that I'll also include, I think, is the linguistic part of things. In our reconstruction or in our interpretation of this framework that we're talking about, we always want to prioritize the languages of the people that we are talking about, whether they are African, whether they are Latino, whether they are Asian. We want to put them at the center. We want to put their languages at the center of interpreting the world, because language is an avenue through which we examine a lot of things, you know. So you think in a certain language, I'm sure you'd understand that. So it's for some people, it's very easy for them to express themselves in a language because they think easily and they can process ideas. They can be more creative when they are speaking in a particular language. So when we center the languages of the former colonized, the languages of these people, we say we are applying decoloniality. We are applying a tenet of decoloniality. So for me, is those three particular aspects. The linguistic part stands out for me because it is important to highlight that what colonialism sought to achieve was a monolinguistic kind of pattern. That's why you see in any colonized country, the languages of those people, sometimes they were banned, sometimes they were downplayed, and they got into the dustbin of history, and one language was introduced. And it was made, a mandate that that's the language that must be used in the workplace, in education, in social spaces. And that is how they became dominant languages. So now when we apply decoloniality, we're trying to decenter that monolingualism, that dominance of one language, so that we can give African people the room to think, theorize, and interpret the world in their languages.
Interesting and very enlightening, Dr. Chikumbu. It also reminds me of some of the terms that I've come across myself just reading the literature, such as pluriversality. The European perspective has often, due to colonialism, to European colonialism that you alluded to, has often been presented as the perspective. Or, for example, there's some scholars who make reference to the fact that we have the Enlightenment, as if they are not other enlightenments, from
yes.
from other geographies.
Decoloniality is a framework of interpreting the world that is not seeking to fight,
Yes.
and say we're fighting Western ways of knowing and
Yes.
trying to downplay them and throw them
Yes.
away. No,
Yes.
we're just appreciating and acknowledging the diversity of the world that we live in,
Yes.
so that we can appreciate it and we can acknowledge it and promote it and put it at the same level to make people understand that there are multiple ways of understanding something and there are multiple ways of interpreting, theorizing, and understanding the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Doc. I just like how you just put it right there. There are multiple ways of understanding the world. There are multiple ways of theorizing, of interpreting the world. And I really like that because it does reinforce the idea that we want to live in a world where there are no hierarchies. We don't want hierarchies, because what colonialism did, in a way, by way of social stratification, it created a hierarchy, sort of a pyramid, the way Professor Gachen would put it, sort of a pyramid where on the basis of, I remember he makes reference to Du Bois's the color line, and how he connects that to the epistemic line, and how it was, according to Professor Gachen, he says that it was then, it's sort of a structure, a stratification which was established where we had, for example, the white body at the top, and then other bodies at the bottom, and hence the white body being attributed the full human density, and
Yes.
any other bodies beneath being denied epistemic virtue, or the
Yes.
ability to, or being delegitimized, or their
Mhm.
ways of knowing and being delegitimized. So I totally agree with you that decoloniality, what the world it seeks to create, is a world without hierarchies when it
Yes.
comes to ways of knowing. There are different ways of knowing. Oral
Mhm.
histories are ways of knowing,
Yeah.
etc. Yeah. So that's a very important point, and thank you for highlighting that. Just to continue with the conversation, which is getting really hot. I'm beginning to enjoy it even more now. I just want to us to dive into the work that you are doing, the amazing work that you have been doing. You wrote a very interesting work which you just published, which is the Forgotten Narratives. And let's talk about that a little bit. Your work, The Forgotten Narratives, brings forward histories that have often been silenced. Could you share an example of a story or perspective that deeply shaped your own approach? And I think I'll just add another question to it, so that in a way you address it as well. What do we as societies lose when such narratives remain unacknowledged?
A lot. We get we
Yeah,
stand
go,
to
go
lose a
go ahead
lot.
and just address
Uh,
this
but
for
uh,
us.
but let me say, I'm glad that you asked about the forgotten narratives. It's an article that I consider to be a very it's an important narrative to me personally, to my people. It's something that I've always wanted to write. So I'll give you a brief history to it that gets us into these concepts. So if you are to, I've dedicated my academic career thus far to extending our knowledge of the role that Africans played in the Second World War, the involvement of African countries, their participation, its consequences, and the way that we commemorate the Second World War in our African countries. So, in my examination of those issues, I've written, if I can say something that will stand out to be very funny and interesting for you. I've gotten 3 degrees so far. I've written dissertations for my undergraduate, for my master's, and for my PhD, and all of those dissertations that I wrote for those degrees were centered on understanding and interpreting the role that the First and the Second World War played in the history of Africa, particularly with the case study of Southern Rhodesia. So here's something that I noticed through my studies. I noticed that much of the history or the recollection that we have today of the history of the Second World War and the involvement of Southern Rhodesia in particular, that is Zimbabwe, has been constructed making use of uh, documents that are usually found in the colonial archive, which is the archive that we find in Harare in Highlands. It is a repository that has quite a lot of things, newspapers, reports, just written documents, and quite a lot of things that historians use to try and write stories and write narratives of what they consider to have happened in the past. So there's a very common narrative that comes out when you read much of those primary sources. And there are actually historians who have written about this and published material. You will see that the Second World War and the involvement of Africans is usually presented as a voluntary kind of experience, that Africans volunteered to participate in this war, that Africans were patriotic. That are some of the arguments that are advanced by the documents that you find in the archive. The newspapers of the time that present an idea that Africans were patriotic. They really liked to serve the colonial government to such an extent that when Hitler declared war against Britain, they volunteered to go and fight for their colonizer, which is something that's very interesting, that people who are living under colonial rule are patriotically, they have patriotic enthusiasm that they are volunteering to go and fight for their colonizer. against another power that is potentially being presented as, a potential colonizer. So much of those documents, they demonize Hitler, and then they present Britain as this country that is going to protect Africans. And this explains why many of them volunteered to participate in the war. But if you go into the communities, Mr. David, and then you ask our grandfathers and mothers if they remember anything about the Second World War, many of them will tell you that we don't remember the Second World War, but they will tell you that we remember Wondo ya Hitler. You get it? They don't remember the Second World War, but they remember Wondo ya Hitler, because what they remember is the propaganda, is the demonization of Hitler, which shows us that there's a narrative that the colonial government was trying to push to the people. And there's a narrative that the colonial government was also trying to push even to the international community. So some of the narratives that come out of the oral histories, and by the way, I have one of the biggest collections of oral histories on Rhodesia, particularly that focus on race and racism. And we learn from some of these oral histories that many of the people that participated in this war did not participate on the basis of voluntarism. They were forced against their will, they were overworked, and they were underpaid. And these are narratives that the colonial government did not want to portray. So it's silenced in many of those documents. But you hear it in oral accounts, you hear it when you go into the communities and speak to the elders. So it is that experience that made me think that we might have some very forgotten narratives, a lot of them, that we are unable to know if we don't seriously decolonize the way that we approach the reconstruction of history. So by decolonizing it, we are going to apply that framework that I've been talking about. We have to decenter Europeanness. We have to say, yes, we have the colonial archive, but what other narratives might we possibly have about this war that we can find elsewhere? So you will be surprised, Mr. David, but many of our people, I have a Facebook page that I run that I communicate with hundreds of families that were affected by this war. They still have the uniforms of their grandfathers. They still have the equipment that the people used during the war. They have kept it. That's their way of commemorating the history of their people. Some of them still have letters. Some of them still have quite a lot of things that we are able to use, pictures and so forth, that we were able to use to reconstruct this narrative. So if I had not applied this approach, I could not have uncovered such a forgotten narrative. And imagine how many forgotten narratives we have in our history and in many other subjects that we might choose to investigate. So that was my methodological approach in my reconstruction of this particular article. So the main argument that I then advanced was that some Africans who participated in that war, they were either hoodwinked or forced to participate in the war. And as a result of their participation, they began to question their position as colonial subjects in the war.
Interesting. They were either hoodwinked or forced. Interesting. Wow. And thank you so much for shining the light on those stories. With your work, I feel from what you have been saying, you do give a voice to the subaltern. You do give a voice to those that are at the margins, the marginalized communities. You do give a voice to, those who may not have otherwise gotten the opportunity to have their stories told in the manner that you help get told. So thank you so much for that. Now, just to we could dwell on that and discuss a little bit further, but we're running out of time. So I want us to quickly move to this aspect where I want to ask you, how can disciplines such as history contribute meaningfully to advancing decoloniality?
Well, history is I consider to be an interdisciplinary subject because we can write about anything. It's only us who can write about anything. For example, this tie I have has a history. We can write about the history of this tie, right? The glasses I have, they have a history. We can write about this. We can write about the history of fashion, the history of computers. So it's a very interdisciplinary subject. So imagine if we apply decoloniality in history and we interpret the histories of multiple aspects of life, how much can we be able to uncover that has been forgotten? How much can we be able to uncover that will help people understand the world in a more meaningful and diverse way? So I think that history is a very important subject. So to just further explain that point, I think it would be important to note that the methodological approaches, especially in history, are the ones that matter a lot. And as much as the reconstruction of this lost history is concerned, we do have historians that are writing, but some are still perpetuating the same kind of narrative and coloniality that we are trying to fight against. If a historian who doesn't have an understanding of these issues gets to try to interpret a history of maybe the army, a history of the police, a history of education, a history of missionary societies, if they just go straight to the colonial archive and they then reproduce what they see in those documents and they bring it out straight to the people, what will be happening? You know the answer. They will be continuing to perpetuate a narrative that the colonizers wanted people to know. So it's very important when us historians reconstruct history to be able to be objective enough and to apply our critical mind to understand that the context against which colonialism, happened, there were certain political agendas, certain political points that our colonizers wanted to score. And if we are not very careful, we will continue scoring those points on their behalf several years after the attainment of independence. So the application of this decolonial approach or decoloniality as a framework for interpreting these issues is very, very critical. It's something that will probably grow in the future. It's already growing. Many historians are applying it. It has to grow and it has to be used in as many aspects as possible of the reconstruction of our history so that we can understand it in a more interesting way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chikumbu. As you were speaking, I just felt it is important to just mention a text that I think would be also important, especially for our viewers and listeners, in understanding when you're talking about the approaches, methodologies. Yeah, there is a book. I'm not sure if it's a thesis or a book that was written by Linda Smith. And it's called Decolonizing Methodologies, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's a very important text. So just to move on with our conversation here, I would like for us to go to an aspect that I have termed here, bridging scholarship and practice. You engage in both historical scholarship and broader policy conversations. How do you bridge these two fields in practice? And maybe as you're thinking about that, I would like to also bring this aspect as well. What does a truly decolonial curriculum look like in higher education? So two questions so far, okay? The first one is, how do you bridge these two fields in practice? And that is historical scholarship and broader policy conversations. And then what does a truly decolonial curriculum look like in higher education? You yourself, you are in higher education.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I would say that there is a temptation by us historians to just reproduce some history, some lost history, and then publish it in a journal or publish it in a book with a university press, and then we go back to our offices and say we have done our job as historians, right? I think that's a good way. We can help the world understand the past that is behind us. But if we don't make an extra effort to connect that past with the present and the possibilities, the challenges and opportunities we face in the future, I think we would not have done a complete job as historians. So I'm not saying I'm the only one who is doing this perfectly, but there are several other historians that are also doing it, are trying to change the approach that we have traditionally had as historians. One of the important things that I've felt for myself whenever when I got into the profession was that I want to approach the discourse in the knowledge industry in a more public intellectual kind of, perspective. So if you look at the majority of the work that I've done and the work that other good historians have done as well out there, I publish material in across various outlets. I've written for newspapers, I've written for the Daily Maverick with you, I have written for the Newsday in Zimbabwe, I've written for both international and local newspapers. I do also do these podcasts. I do also write journal articles. I do also write books. So I find ways to articulate academic knowledge in various outlets. Outlets that have people that receive this kind of discourse in a different way. People who read newspapers expect a certain structure, expect issues to be articulated in a certain way. People in the academic and knowledge industry expect issues to be addressed in a certain way. So that's one good way to make history appealing to different groups of people and so that they can see the value of history. We produce documentaries, we produce podcasts that are based on historical stuff that make people understand the past that they're coming from. But more importantly, we don't just say this history, we don't just tell this history. At the center of many of the questions I ask for my podcast, for the publications I make, is that since we have seen that there is a problem that was created in history, we have examined a particular history, we've seen that they are forgotten narratives. We've examined a certain history, we've seen that some people were formerly enslaved, some people lost their land, some people were discriminated against on a racial basis. The biggest question becomes that what can we do today that we have been given this history? What can we do today to correct the kind of problems that we are facing? So in some of the publications that we've done, including with you, you see that we center democracy at the center, we center youth participation, we center the adoption of so many different policies that are inclusive, that are considerate of the history that we are coming from, so that we can be able to move, in a good and in a right direction. Even the approach that I use in my teaching, I always expose students to colonialism because that's what I teach. I teach them the life of colonialism, how it began, how it was consolidated, how it was dismantled. I do the same with apartheid. But more importantly, what we try to do is, if this is a problem that was created to African people throughout history, what can we do now to correct those kind of imbalances, because we still have them. Colonialism, like you said, is not over, but it's all over. So I think that's one important approach. And I can also say that in my approach to that kind of discourse, to answer the second question, there's something that I do that is interesting with some of my students. When we approach these classes, I teach mostly international students who are not African, who are from different parts of the world, Americans, Canadians, Europeans. So I try to initially get them to start consulting African sources when we're dealing with African history. So in some instances, when I'm dealing with modern topics, I ask them to go and read African newspapers and come back and tell us what they think about the opinion pieces, the reporting that they are seeing in African newspapers. Otherwise, nobody reads them. Some are mostly used to reading international newspapers that publish stuff based on how international people and foreign correspondents understand what's going on in Africa. So that's one thing that I do to try and center the African story in the knowledge construction, in the learning process, the teaching and learning process. I also encourage the use of sources by historians from Africa as well, so that we understand things from the African perspective. African TV programs, African documentaries, African oral histories, African podcasters, so that we address that second principal tenet of decoloniality, where we center Africanness, where we center the African discourse, the African narrative, in the production of knowledge and even in the learning experience itself. I also encourage them, many of them in many of our universities now, we have African studies programs that teach African languages. So many people today, I'm sure you've seen the rise of Swahili in the international space. We strongly encourage in the knowledge industry the learning of African languages so that people in the international community begin to understand the African story from the African language. So we actually now have so many students that have taken Bantu languages as their second language, and it has helped them a lot. You see that the student who has taken a Bantu language is able to perform very well in an African history class or in an African politics class or in an African studies class, because they already now start to understand the African story in an African language. So that's one important thing that we have, me and many other people have tried to do to center, the African language in the knowledge production and in the learning process, and to also center African sources, African writers, African television programs, African radios at the center of this experience, African syllabuses.
Interesting, Dr. Chikumbu. It reminds me of Linda Smith's work again, because I think she does advance an argument that the people that should research indigenous communities should be people that are members of that community, so that they're able to sort of capture, the certain nuances, as far as the research is concerned, as a way of decolonizing, or applying decoloniality to research. So I just thought of that as well as you were speaking. What practical steps can universities, both in the global south and in the global north, where you are teaching, what steps can they take to move beyond Eurocentric models of knowledge?
Interesting. One example that I'm going to quickly give is that of cultural, like educational intercultural exchange programs. They have a very powerful and important way of getting this, this framework popularized and adopted, in our teaching and in our learning. Many of the universities in the United States do this. They call it a study abroad program. But it's modeled in a different way, but I'll briefly explain what it's like. So at some point, students in an American university, they can apply to go and study at a university in Africa for a semester or two, take classes there, learn with the students there, live in the African setting with African people, and get to have that experience. But in some cases, some students treat it as a tourist kind of venture in which they just go to experience, a different country with funding from a university or stuff. But that's a very good way, because at the center of decoloniality, Mr. David, it's not just us Africans centering Africanness in knowledge production, teaching, and learning. It's also the former imperial powers admitting and acknowledging that it is important for us to also promote knowledge from the global south and to also dismantle the dominance of our ways of seeing the African experience and the African story. So exchange programs are a very good way from both sides. So the only challenge we have today is that of funding, that in our mostly African universities or global south universities, it's hard to raise funds to get our students to go into different other universities and get to spread the knowledge of, or their knowledge or their histories and ways of understanding things in different other places. It's very hard to do that. What actually happens is that many of the students in the global south, they get scholarships, they go abroad, and they also get to perpetuate the same Eurocentrism and Western hegemony that we are also trying to descend. So that's the biggest challenge. But those exchange programs would be a very good way, because what needs to happen is to popularize this, is to make it a dominant school of thought that has to be applied, adopted and utilized in different disciplines and in different universities. Importantly, Mr. David, we should have centers of decolonial schools in many of these universities, just like we have centers of military studies, centers of science and technology, centers of education. I think it would be very important for us to have a center of decolonial school. That would be a very good way to get this discourse to as many places as possible in this world.
I was attending a program, a conference in the UK. That was at the University of Edinburgh, sometime early this year, I think. Yeah, and this topic of decoloniality did come up, and I think this question that I've just asked you, I think it also did emerge, and I also got the opportunity to also contribute to the discussion, and I did raise a point where I was sort of saying that there could be need for these institutions, especially here in the global north, to also sort of not only invite students from the global south, but also sort of also bring in, people like traditional leaders, that are, these are people, when you look at the current knowledge system, you see that these are at the margins, they are marginalized. But I think if we're going to understand African concepts, if we're going to understand African experiences or African history, I think these are people, these are figures that could meaningfully contribute to the discussion. So I was of the opinion that we could have a program where we have these guys coming in as visitors. Yes, they may not be formal educators, but when it comes, depending on the topic, that you're exploring, I think these could come in and give a meaningful contribution and give more of an accurate presentation of facts as far as a particular subject is concerned. What do you think
Yes,
about that idea?
that's a very brilliant one, because is one problem that happens with the knowledge industry. It restricts knowledge production, dissemination, teaching, and the experience of learning itself to a particular group and set of people, which we
Mm-hmm,
call academics and scholars.
mm-hmm,
And it becomes a preserve
mm-hmm,
of the university
mm-hmm,
and of the professor and of the
mm-hmm,
lecturer.
mm-hmm,
But we must understand something about knowledge, Mr. David.
mm-hmm,
Knowledge is very, very complicated.
mm-hmm,
It's sophisticated, and there's no place which you can say there is the place that has knowledge. If you go
mm-hmm,
there, you get
mm-hmm,
knowledge. You can't
mm-hmm,
point that place, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
You also can't identify a particular group of people and say, these are the people who have knowledge. You
mm-hmm,
can't do that, right?
mm-hmm,
You
mm-hmm,
also you really can't identify a particular gender and say, this is the gender that has knowledge.
mm-hmm,
Knowledge is everywhere, just like we said, colonialism is not over, it is all over. Knowledge is all over. So
mm-hmm,
if we really want to make the best out of it, we have
mm-hmm.
to be very inclusive, in its production and in its dissemination and its teaching. We must be able to be very inclusive. So I think you have a very important point that has to be incorporated.
Dr. Chikumbu, I love the word you just mentioned, inclusion.
Yes.
Inclusion is the key word there. Inclusion. We need to, approach education in such a manner that we make space, we accommodate these important contributors as far as education is concerned. What forms of resistance have you encountered when advancing decolonial approaches in academia or policy spaces?
Oh, yes. The most common thing, I'll say the most common thing is that the moment you adopt a decolonial perspective or an approach to try and interpret something, you are mostly labeled as an activist scholar. You get it? You're mostly labeled in a political way as if you're up for a fight, which is why, to emphasize the point I initially talked about when we started the podcast, that this approach is not a fight. When you are fighting for inclusion, you are just saying, let us all sit on the eating table and have the meal. We are not saying we are going to take away your food
Mm-hmm,
and then eat it for us. No, we are saying, let us all sit on the table and let us all eat. So that's one big problem, that when you adopt the decolonial school and when you adopt the decolonial perspective, in most circles, you are highly likely to be perceived as an activist political scholar. And once you carry that label, it is very difficult to have good reception in many circles whether it be academic conferences, whether it be any particular circle, it doesn't then become a receptive kind of like approach and discourse. And, if it goes down to the students, it becomes a scary thing for students to learn, They begin to feel like it's so strange and maybe it's probably not necessary for them to learn. So that's one big challenge that, I have seen, that I've seen others facing as well. And it is important for it to be addressed. That's why I had to emphasize that it's not a fight.
It is not a fight indeed. And another important concept came to mind, or idea, which is the idea of participation. I think all the Global South is asking for is to be afforded the opportunity to participate. To participate in what? Participate in theorizing, participate in knowledge production. That's all they are asking for. And I think it adds to what you mentioned earlier, a very important point where you talked about inclusion. It is a question of also being included. On the other hand, where do you see the most promising opportunities for meaningful decolonial change in the next decade?
Oh, yes. It could be places, it could be platforms, it could be so many things. But let's remember that, we are living in the fourth industrial revolution, which is being, drastically changed by artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning. We don't want decoloniality as an approach to be left out of those kind of developments. Because if it is left out, we will have to fight again to have it included in those kinds of spaces. Many people are using artificial intelligence, but does it approach things in a decolonial way? We have to be very mindful of that. So we have the digital space. We need transformation that is serious on the digital space. It has to be there. We also have the academic space, obviously, the traditional institutions, our universities, our colleges, but also at government level. We also need our governments, our parliaments, our cabinets to seriously take this discourse and to consider applying some of the things, even at policy level. It will be important for governments to actually adopt a very particular policy that speaks to this. An important area as well would be civil society. It would be very important for us to have a civil society that acknowledges this, because these are institutions that work with people in a significant way, and they're at the center of controlling what people consider knowledge, what people consider to be important ideas in a society.
This has been such a rich and deeply engaging conversation. Before we wrap up, I would like to ask if you could leave our audience with one key reflection on decoloniality to guide their everyday work and lives, what would it be?
Well, I would want people to appreciate and understand that we live in a very diverse world, a world in which we have different races, a world in which we have different ages, a world in which we have different religious groups, political groups, we have different ethnic, tribal groups and nationalities. So it is very hard for us to have a harmonious world if we do not appreciate and acknowledge that kind of diversity that we have. So what is at the center of this diversity and acknowledging it and living with it is understand that we have different ways of knowing things. And we have different ways of understanding, of theorizing and interpreting the world from our perspective. So what will help the world going forward is acknowledging and respecting these aspects. The days of forcing a group of people by coercion, by means of domination or colonialism, to force them to use your ways of knowing or to use your ways of interpreting and theorizing the world, they are over. We are in a new age, we are in a new globalized space, especially with the digital technologies that we have today. And we have to appreciate that kind of diversity, respect it, so that we can have a world of multiple knowledges, a world of multiple ways of knowing, so that we can live harmonious. I think that is what I can say.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Chikumbu. That was so powerful. That was so deep. and I would like to just highlight issues to do with mutual respect, issues to do with diversity that you mentioned to be very important and key going forward as well. Now, Dr. Chikumbu, thank you so much for your insights and for sharing your journey with us. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. This episode of the Global South Indaba reminds us that decoloniality is not just theory, it is lived practice. It is struggle, and it is also opportunity. To stay connected, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Global South Indaba and visit Global South Opportunities for a wide range of opportunities, including jobs, internships, scholarships, fellowships, conferences, free online courses with certificates and funding or grants. Until next time, let us continue to reflect and to build a more just and inclusive world. Thank you and goodbye.